In the spring of 1803, along the wild banks of the Mississippi River, a band of armed men overpowered their guards, seized weapons, and vanished into the wilderness. Their leader was Samuel Mason, a former Revolutionary War captain turned notorious river pirate. He had been captured, tried, and was being transported upriver for execution. But Samuel Mason would not hang that day. His escape raised a terrifying question for the struggling frontier settlements. What happens when a criminal escapes justice in a society with no police force, no prisons, and no means of pursuit across vast, lawless territories? In colonial and early America, before organized law enforcement existed, escaped criminals faced a stark choice: disappear into the wilderness and live as outlaws, or risk recapture by bounty hunters, vigilante mobs, and desperate posses. This is the story of what happened when the law failed, and when criminals slipped through the cracks of America's most vulnerable justice system. Between 1607 and the early 1800s, the American colonies and later, the young United States, operated without anything resembling modern police forces. Instead, law enforcement was a patchwork quilt of constables, sheriffs, night watches, militias, and ordinary citizens pressed into service through the ancient Anglo-Saxon tradition of hue and cry. Boston established one of the first night watches in 1631, requiring citizens to patrol the streets after dark and raise the alarm if crimes occurred. Philadelphia formalized its watch system in 1700, yet these systems were fundamentally reactive, not proactive. Constables were often unpaid or poorly compensated, serving reluctantly for short terms. Sheriffs appointed or elected in each county had broad responsibilities, collecting taxes, supervising elections, running jails, and occasionally pursuing criminals, but lacked the resources for extended manhunts. When a crime occurred, the burden of pursuit fell on the community itself. Under the hue and cry system, any person witnessing a felony was legally obligated to raise an alarm, with horn and voice, summoning neighbors to join the chase. If a criminal escaped the immediate vicinity, the constable or sheriff could invoke posse comitatus, deputizing able-bodied men to form a posse and pursue the fugitive. But this system had severe limitations. The American frontier offered criminals something no European outlaw possessed: endless wilderness. Beyond the settled communities along the eastern seaboard stretched millions of acres of dense forest, treacherous swamps, and unmapped river systems. A fugitive with survival skills, knowledge of the terrain, or alliances with Native American groups could vanish for years or forever. The Great Dismal Swamp, straddling Virginia and North Carolina, became a notorious refuge not only for escaped slaves but also for fugitive criminals, deserters, and outcasts. Covering over 112,000 acres of dense, wet forest, the swamp was virtually impenetrable to law enforcement. Maroon communities, groups of escaped people living beyond the reach of authorities, established hidden settlements deep in the swamp's interior. Similarly, Cave-in Rock on the Ohio River emerged as an outlaw haven. This massive limestone cavern, with its 55-foot-wide entrance and 160-foot depth, provided natural shelter and a commanding view of river traffic. From this strategic position, criminals could prey on flatboats carrying settlers and goods downriver, then retreat into the cave's protection. Pursuing criminals across colonial or state borders created jurisdictional nightmares. Each colony, and later, each state, operated under its own legal code. A constable or sheriff from Virginia had no authority in Maryland. Extradition between colonies was informal and voluntary, depending on intercolonial comity, essentially, neighborly goodwill. The Articles of Confederation, 1781, included no provision for interstate extradition. Not until the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788 did Article IV, Section 2, establish the principle. A person charged in any state with treason, felony, or other crime, who shall flee from justice and be found in another state, shall on demand of the executive authority of the state from which he fled, be delivered up. Yet even then, enforcement was slow and inconsistent. Governors could, and did, refuse extradition requests. For criminals operating along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, which formed borders between multiple territories and states, this jurisdictional confusion was a godsend. Samuel Mason exploited it brilliantly, committing crimes on U.S. soil along the Mississippi's eastern bank, then retreating across the river into Spanish-controlled Louisiana. U.S. law enforcement couldn't follow. Spanish authorities had no interest in prosecuting crimes committed against Americans. Pursuit was expensive. A constable earned perhaps £20 per year. A sheriff's income came primarily from fees for serving warrants, transporting prisoners, or executing court orders. Extended manhunts meant days or weeks away from other duties and income. Communities lacked budgets for sustained law enforcement operations. This economic reality shaped colonial justice. Communities invested resources in capturing criminals who posed immediate local threats but rarely pursued fugitives who fled the area. The result: escaping the immediate vicinity often meant escaping justice entirely. It was into this fragmented, under-resourced, geographically challenged system that some of America's most notorious outlaws emerged, and from which many escaped, at least temporarily, to live as fugitives on the violent frontier. No outlaws in early American history inspired more terror than Micajah, Big Harpe, and wily Little Harpe. Born in the 1760s as Joshua and William Harper, these brothers transformed frontier violence into an art form of sadistic cruelty. Unlike typical highway robbers who killed for profit, the Harpes seemed to murder for pleasure, often leaving their victims' money untouched. The Harpes first appeared in Knoxville, Tennessee, in 1797, living with two women they claimed as wives. They quickly gained a reputation for petty theft and violence. When local authorities moved to arrest them, the Harpes and their companions fled into the wilderness, beginning a 2-year reign of terror across Kentucky and Tennessee. Their killing method was distinctive and brutal. They would befriend travelers, share campsites, then murder victims in their sleep, often disemboweling them, filling the body cavities with stones and sinking corpses in rivers. Estimates suggest they killed between 20 and 40 people, though the true number will never be known. The Harpes' ability to evade capture stemmed from several factors. They constantly moved between settlements, never staying long in one area. They exploited the wilderness, hiding in caves and dense forests where posses couldn't track them. And they manipulated the fragmented jurisdiction system. When Kentucky authorities pursued them, they fled to Tennessee. When Tennessee organized against them, they crossed back into Kentucky. In early 1799, the Harpes were finally captured in Kentucky and jailed in Danville, charged with multiple murders. The community believed justice would finally be served. But on the night before their scheduled trial, the Harpes overpowered their jailer. A single guard assigned to watch them broke out of the primitive log jail and disappeared back into the wilderness. For 6 more months, the killing spree continued. Bodies turned up along trails and near cabins. Panic gripped frontier settlements. Women and children were evacuated to blockhouses. Men traveled in armed groups. The Harpes had become folkloric monsters, credited with every unsolved murder across hundreds of miles. The end came in August 1799. After the Harpes murdered a young boy, his father, a man named Stegall, organized a posse that tracked the brothers relentlessly through the Kentucky wilderness. Near present-day Webster County, Kentucky, the posse cornered Big Harpe. In the ensuing fight, Harpe was shot and mortally wounded. What happened next became frontier legend. Rather than simply allowing Harpe to die or executing him with a bullet, Stegall reportedly performed a gruesome act of frontier justice. He slowly cut off Big Harpe's head while the outlaw was still alive and conscious. Harpe's last words were allegedly, "You're a god-damned rough butcher, but cut on and be damned." Big Harpe's severed head was mounted on a pole at a crossroads, a location thereafter known as Harpe's Head. as a warning to other outlaws. The display remained there for years, slowly decomposing, a grim testament to frontier justice. Little Harpe escaped and fled south to the Mississippi River region, where he would later resurface under the alias John Sutton, joining Samuel Mason's river pirate gang. The Harpe Brothers' story demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of escape in early America. For nearly 2 years, they lived as successful fugitives, murdering with seeming impunity. When briefly captured, they escaped. Yet ultimately, the informal justice system, ordinary citizens forming posses, tracking fugitives through wilderness, and administering brutal punishment, caught up with them. Their case also revealed the psychological impact of escaped criminals on frontier communities. The mere knowledge that murderers were loose in the wilderness transformed daily life, forcing settlements into a constant state of vigilance and fear. Samuel Mason's transformation from respected Revolutionary War captain to notorious outlaw illustrates how escaping justice wasn't simply a matter of evading physical capture. It required creating an entirely new identity and economy in the wilderness. Born in Virginia in 1739, Samuel Mason served honorably under Colonel George Washington at Fort Necessity in 1760, fought in campaigns to defend frontier settlements during the Revolutionary War, and afterward served as Justice of the Peace in Washington County, Pennsylvania, a position of considerable community trust. But by the early 1790s, Mason had transformed into a criminal entrepreneur. Historians debate what triggered this transformation. Some point to financial difficulties following the war, others to the lack of promised veteran compensation, still others to the opportunity presented by increasing river traffic and weak law enforcement. By 1797, Mason and his gang had converted Cave-in Rock into a sinister river inn. They posted signs advertising Wilson's Liquor Vault and House for entertainment, luring flatboats to shore. Once travelers landed, Mason's gang, including his own sons and various female accomplices, would ply them with alcohol, inspect their cargo, then rob or murder them depending on potential witnesses and cargo value. Mason's criminal success derived largely from his sophisticated understanding of jurisdictional boundaries. Operating primarily along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, he committed robberies on the American eastern bank, then immediately crossed to Spanish-controlled Louisiana on the western bank. In March 1800, Mason even obtained an official passport from Spanish authorities in New Madrid, Missouri, allowing him legal residence in Spanish territory. This passport became his safety net. After each robbery or murder in U.S. territory, he simply rowed across the river to his legal sanctuary. U.S. law enforcement couldn't pursue him without creating an international incident. This wasn't simply good luck, it was calculated criminal strategy. Mason recognized that the young United States, weak and diplomatically fragile, would never risk conflict with Spain over pursuing river pirates. He essentially created a one-man criminal enterprise with built-in immunity. Mason's gang employed multiple strategies to avoid capture. Beyond Cave-in Rock, Mason maintained camps at Red Banks, Kentucky, and Wolf Island in the Mississippi. When pressure mounted in one location, he moved to another. Survivors were often given a choice: join the gang or die. Some victims, coerced into working with Mason, provided cover and intelligence about law enforcement movements. Mason and his men frequently changed names and appearances. They posed as legitimate river traders, sold stolen goods in distant markets like New Orleans, and blended into river traffic. Mason cultivated relationships with local officials, using stolen money to buy information and protection. Mason's luck finally ran out in January 1803, when Spanish authorities in New Madrid, under pressure from U.S. officials, arrested his entire gang. The evidence was overwhelming. In Mason's possession were $7,000 in banknotes from recent robberies, stolen goods, multiple weapons, and even human scalps from victims. After a trial in Spanish-controlled New Madrid, Authorities decided the crimes fell under U.S. jurisdiction and ordered Mason's transfer to Natchez for prosecution. On March 26, 1803, while being transported up the Mississippi by boat, Mason and his gang executed one of the most dramatic escapes in frontier history. Captain Robert McCoy and his guards had become complacent during the slow upriver journey. Taking advantage of a stop for repairs at Point Coupee Parish, Louisiana, Mason's gang seized hidden weapons and overpowered the guards. In the ensuing fight, Mason allegedly shot Captain McCoy in the chest and shoulder, while McCoy returned fire, wounding Mason in the head. Despite injuries, Mason and most of his gang disappeared into the wilderness. Spanish and U.S. authorities posted substantial rewards, dead or alive. For months, Mason evaded capture, but the manhunt never ceased. In late 1803, two men, James May and John Sutton, actually Little Harpe, the surviving Harpe brother, offered to track down Mason in exchange for the reward and legal amnesty for their own crimes. What happened next remains clouded in mystery and conflicting accounts. May and Sutton returned to Greenville, Mississippi Territory in January 1804, carrying Mason's severed head preserved in a ball of blue clay. They presented it to authorities, claiming they had found Mason hiding near Lake Concordia, Louisiana, and killed him in a confrontation. But the identification process went terribly wrong. When Mason's wife, Rosanna, was brought in to identify the head, she declared it was not her husband. Other witnesses were uncertain. Authorities began to suspect May and Sutton had murdered an innocent man to collect the reward. Both men were arrested, tried for murder, and convicted. On February 8, 1804, they were hanged at the same location where they had presented the mysterious head. Their own severed heads were then mounted on poles along the Natchez Trace, one north of Greenville, one south, as warnings to other outlaws. The location where Sutton's head was displayed became known as Sutton's Hill. Did Mason truly die in 1803, or did he escape one final time? Some historians believe the head was indeed Mason's, and that his wife lied to protect any remaining gang members or hidden assets. Others theorize Mason escaped to Canada or the Western Territories, living under an assumed name until his natural death years later. No definitive proof has ever emerged. What we know with certainty is this: Samuel Mason's career demonstrates how escaping justice in early America required not just physical evasion, but sophisticated understanding of geography, jurisdiction, criminal networks, and human psychology. He transformed a frontier weakness, the lack of centralized law enforcement, into a decade-long criminal enterprise that terrorized thousands of miles of riverways. When criminals escaped, who hunted them? In the absence of professional police, three groups emerged: bounty hunters motivated by rewards, citizen posses organized by local officials, and vigilante groups taking law into their own hands. Colonial and early American authorities frequently offered cash rewards for fugitive capture, typically £50 to £100, equivalent to a year's wages for a laborer. Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette regularly published these notices. A typical advertisement might read, $50 reward. Escaped from custody, one Thomas Jones, aged about 30 years, 5 feet 9 inches tall, dark complexion, scar above left eye. Last seen heading toward the Ohio country. Any person apprehending said Jones and delivering him to the undersigned sheriff shall receive the above reward. These advertisements created a crude but effective bounty hunting system. Opportunistic trackers, often former soldiers or frontiersmen with tracking skills, would pursue high-value fugitives. Success rates were difficult to determine, but enough bounties were collected to keep the system functioning. The bounty system had serious flaws. It encouraged false captures, innocent people wrongly identified and delivered for reward money. It also created perverse incentives. Bounty hunters might allow criminals to continue operating, capturing them multiple times after staged escapes. And it resulted in brutal methods. Many bounty hunters killed fugitives rather than attempting difficult live captures, collecting rewards for corpses or body parts as proof. The posse represented community-based justice. When a sheriff or constable needed assistance pursuing a fugitive, he could legally deputize any able-bodied male citizen aged 15 to 60. Refusing to join a posse was technically a criminal offense, though enforcement was spotty. Posses varied wildly in effectiveness. Some, organized quickly from tavern patrons or farmers working nearby fields, were poorly equipped and gave up after a few hours. Others, particularly those pursuing murderers like the Harpes, sustained weeks-long manhunts through difficult terrain. The posse system reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of community justice. When citizens were motivated, usually by a local crime affecting someone they knew, they could be relentless. Colonel Joshua Baker's pursuit of Samuel Mason after being robbed twice demonstrated this determination. But when crimes affected distant communities or unknown victims, recruitment was difficult and pursuit half-hearted. When formal systems failed repeatedly, communities sometimes abandoned legal process entirely. Vigilante groups, extra-legal organizations claiming to maintain order where official justice was absent or ineffective, appeared throughout the frontier. The San Francisco Committee of Vigilance, 1851 and 1856, remains the most famous example, but similar groups operated across Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley in the late 1700s and early 1800s. These regulators took various forms. Some merely supplemented official law enforcement by conducting patrols and reporting crimes. Others took law entirely into their own hands, conducting trials and executions without legal authority. The regulator movement in South Carolina, 1767–1769, targeted bandits and horse thieves who had effectively escaped colonial justice. The regulators captured, tried, and punished suspects according to their own rules, often with brutal floggings or summary executions. While officially illegal, these actions were tolerated, sometimes even quietly endorsed, by overwhelmed colonial authorities. Vigilante justice was swift and brutal but deeply flawed. Without legal process, innocent people were executed based on rumor or mistaken identity. Vigilante groups sometimes evolved into gangs themselves, using the mantle of justice to settle personal vendettas or seize property. And they established a dangerous precedent, that communities could bypass legal systems whenever those systems seemed inadequate. Yet for fugitive criminals, vigilantes posed perhaps the greatest threat. Unlike constables bound by jurisdictional limits or sheriffs dependent on court authorization, vigilantes recognized no boundaries. They pursued fugitives across state lines, into wilderness areas, and administered punishment immediately upon capture. For outlaws, escaping official justice often meant facing unofficial justice, which was frequently far more severe. The phenomenon of escaped criminals living as outlaws profoundly shaped American frontier society, leaving impacts that echoed for generations. Knowledge that dangerous criminals roamed freely transformed daily frontier life. Isolated cabins were abandoned in favor of fortified settlements. Travelers moved in armed groups rather than alone. Women and children were evacuated to blockhouses at the first rumor of outlaw activity. The Harpe Brothers' presence in an area could depopulate an entire district as families fled to safer regions. This fear accelerated settlement patterns. The scattered individual homesteads that characterized early Kentucky and Tennessee frontiers gave way to clustered communities offering mutual protection. Ironically, outlaws, by creating danger, hastened the establishment of the very civilization that would eventually eliminate them. Escaped criminals disrupted commerce on a massive scale. River piracy along the Ohio and Mississippi forced merchants to calculate robbery as a routine business expense. Some traders hired armed guards, costly protection that raised prices for frontier consumers. Others organized convoys, multiple boats traveling together for safety, which slowed delivery times and reduced efficiency. Insurance markets barely existed on the frontier. A merchant whose cargo was stolen by Mason's gang at Cave-in Rock simply absorbed total loss. This economic uncertainty deterred legitimate businesses and contributed to the frontier's isolation from Eastern markets. The persistent escape of dangerous criminals eroded confidence in formal justice systems. If constables couldn't hold prisoners, sheriffs couldn't pursue fugitives across borders, and courts couldn't guarantee execution of sentences, what good were official institutions? This crisis of confidence birthed vigilantism, the substitution of community violence for legal process. While vigilante action sometimes successfully captured outlaws that official systems had failed to apprehend, it established terrible precedents. Once communities accepted extralegal violence as legitimate, the line between justice and revenge blurred dangerously. The Harpe's brutal execution, Big Harpe's head slowly sawed off while still alive, and the display of severed heads on poles, Masons, the Harpes, and others, demonstrated how far frontier justice had diverged from legal norms. These weren't official punishments authorized by courts. They were community rituals of vengeance, meant to terrorize potential criminals and reassure frightened populations. Paradoxically, the failure of amateur systems created pressure for professionalization. Communities that lost repeated battles against organized crime began demanding full-time, paid law enforcement. The Mississippi Territory, ravaged by river piracy, was among the first regions to establish standing militia units with explicit law enforcement duties. Kentucky and Tennessee followed. By the 1810s, a recognizable pattern emerged. Frontier regions initially relied on constables and posses. Repeated failure against organized criminals prompted vigilante responses. Vigilante excess created demand for professional alternatives. And finally, professional police forces were established. The very criminals who exploited weak enforcement systems inadvertently created political will to strengthen them. Escaped outlaws became folk heroes in American mythology. Samuel Mason, despite being a murderer and robber, appears in some historical accounts as a gentleman bandit who supposedly spared brave victims and adhered to a personal code. Similarly, later outlaws like Jesse James were romanticized as Robin Hood figures despite their actual records of violence. This romanticization served a purpose. It transformed frightening realities into manageable narratives. Communities that had lived in terror could, after threats passed, reimagine outlaws as colorful characters in their settlement stories rather than perpetual reminders of their own vulnerability. The challenges faced by early Americans in dealing with escaped criminals resonate powerfully with contemporary debates about criminal justice, cross-jurisdictional crime, and community policing. Just as Samuel Mason exploited the boundary between U.S. and Spanish territories, modern criminals exploit international borders. Drug cartels operate along the U.S. Mexico border in ways that echo Mason's strategy, committing crimes in one jurisdiction, then retreating to safety in another where extradition is difficult or non-existent. Similarly, cybercriminals today operate from countries with weak extradition treaties or enforcement, attacking victims across international borders with relative impunity. The fundamental problem, that law enforcement authority stops at borders while criminal networks don't, remains unsolved despite 2 centuries of institutional development. Modern community policing initiatives, which emphasize partnership between law enforcement and citizens, echo the posse comitatus tradition. Neighborhood watch programs essentially deputize civilians to monitor, report, and sometimes confront suspicious activity. Much like colonial hue and cry systems, required community participation in pursuing criminals. But the thin line between community engagement and vigilantism remains troubling. When communities lose faith in official police responses, vigilante impulses resurface. The Guardian Angels, formed in 1979 New York City, or modern border militia groups patrolling for illegal crossings, reflect the same dynamic that created frontier regulators: frustration with inadequate official enforcement leading citizens to take law into their own hands. The 2020 killing of Ahmaud Arbery by 3 Georgia men who claimed to be conducting a citizen's arrest illustrates the danger. Their invocation of an old Georgia law, since repealed, that directly descended from colonial pursuit traditions demonstrates how ancient legal concepts, designed for a world without professional police, can be tragically misapplied in modern contexts. If colonial America had wanted posters, modern society has CCTV, facial recognition, GPS tracking, and databases. Technology has partially solved the problem of fugitives disappearing into wilderness. There simply isn't much wilderness left to disappear into, and what remains is increasingly monitored. Yet technology creates new versions of old problems. Criminals don't need physical wilderness when they can hide in digital anonymity. The dark web, cryptocurrency, and encrypted communications provide modern outlaws with virtual territories beyond law enforcement's easy reach, spaces as inaccessible to authorities as the Great Dismal Swamp was to colonial sheriffs. Economic constraints that limited colonial pursuit of fugitives persist today. Police departments have finite budgets. Prosecutors must prioritize cases. The FBI's most wanted list functions partly as a rationing mechanism, highlighting cases worthy of sustained, expensive investigation while implicitly deprioritizing others. Rural areas particularly face challenges echoing frontier conditions: large territories, few officers, limited budgets. A sheriff in a Montana county of 5,000 square miles with a 2-person department faces resource constraints that would have been familiar to colonial sheriffs 3 centuries ago. Perhaps most interesting is the modern restorative justice movement's implicit recognition that formal criminal justice systems aren't always effective or appropriate. By emphasizing community-based responses to crime, victim-offender mediation, and reintegration rather than punishment, restorative justice advocates echo, perhaps unconsciously, the community-centered approach of early American settlements. Before professional police, communities necessarily dealt with criminals and their crimes directly. Not all of that was vigilante violence. Much involved negotiation, restitution, and reintegration. Modern restorative justice programs suggest that some lessons from that era, particularly for nonviolent crimes, might be worth recovering. What happens when a criminal escapes the law in a lawless society? Early America provided a generations-long experiment in answering this question, and the results were mixed, brutal, and surprisingly nuanced. Some escaped criminals, like the Harpe Brothers, lived as fugitives until persistent community pursuit caught up with them, resulting in executions that barely qualified as justice. Others, like Samuel Mason, exploited systemic weaknesses so skillfully that their ultimate fates remain mysteries. Still others vanished into the wilderness or were absorbed into frontier communities, their crimes forgotten or forgiven. A society that allowed these escapes also developed responses: bounty systems, posse networks, and eventually vigilante violence when official systems failed. These responses were themselves problematic, sometimes as lawless as the criminals they targeted, but they reveal a fundamental truth: communities facing persistent threats will find ways to protect themselves, whether through legal means or otherwise. The informal justice system of early America wasn't gentle or fair, but it was ultimately effective. By the 1830s, organized outlawry on the American frontier had largely ceased, not because wilderness areas disappeared or jurisdictional problems were solved, but because communities developed sufficient institutional capacity to pursue, capture, and punish fugitives with reasonable consistency. This history offers lessons for modern societies grappling with similar challenges. First, criminal justice systems require sufficient resources to function. Constables who worked for free or minimal pay couldn't sustain long pursuits, just as under-resourced modern police departments struggle with complex investigations. Second, jurisdictional boundaries create opportunities for criminals that can only be addressed through cooperation between jurisdictions, a lesson still being learned in context from international drug trafficking to cybercrime. Third, when official systems repeatedly fail, communities will create alternatives, often dangerous ones. Perhaps most importantly, the early American experience demonstrates that informal justice systems, while imperfect, aren't necessarily inferior to formal ones. Sometimes the sheriff and posse succeeded where courts had failed. Sometimes community knowledge identified criminals that distant authorities couldn't recognize. The challenge, then and now, is channeling community engagement toward justice rather than vengeance. What do you think? Could a modern society function without professional police, relying instead on community-based justice like colonial America? What lessons from frontier pursuit of fugitives apply to today's challenges with cross-border crime and digital anonymity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this exploration of early American crime and justice fascinating, please like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into historical mysteries, and check out our other documentaries on how early Americans dealt with organized crime without a police force.